Hey everyone, I'm Kayla. I have changed locations into my bedroom. I really enjoy the lighting coming from the window right there. So we are going to record this video today here. I wanted to do a two-part video on specific things concerning measurement of jewelry. So in this first video, we're going to talk about gauge, and then the second video, we're going to talk about length and diameter. A lot of jewelry has this word gauge attached to it, and a lot of people don't know what this actually means. So in this video, I'm going to talk about what gauge is and how to measure gauge. And then in the second video, I'm going to talk about length and diameter. When you look at a piece of jewelry, you want to measure either the length, and if it's a hoop, you want to measure that diameter. So when we're talking about gauge, we're talking about the thickness of a material. The definition of gauge is a measurement of thickness in the size or capacity of something, and this is especially the case when measuring metal wire. You can find gauge associated with craft wire, electrical wire, and industrial metal wire. When I was writing this video, I went to YouTube and I typed in what is gauge, and the majority of videos that came up were either craft videos with crochet and jewelry making, or like manufacturing videos dealing with electrical wire, or just wire with like in manufacturing or industry type situations. So I wanted to make a video on body piercing and what gauge means to jewelry and body piercing. Like I said earlier, a lot of jewelry has this word gauge attached to it, and so I just want to explain and help you understand what that means. Gauge is a measurement system all on its own beside the imperial system and the metric system, which I think is pretty interesting. There's a type of ruler we use to measure the sizes of gauge, and this is the gauge wheel or gauge disc. On one side of the gauge wheel, it shows the measurements from 36 to 0, and these are gauge. 36 is very thin, about the size of a strand of hair, and then 0 is about the width of my pinky finger. When you start learning about gauge, it can get really confusing because the smaller the number you have, the larger the amount of material you have, and that goes the opposite way as well. The smaller amount of material you have, the higher or larger the number would be, the gauge would be. So when we compare the 36 and the 0, the strand of hair on my pinky finger, it's quite a significant difference. I did a little bit of research on gauges and found that there's about 40 or 41 different gauge sizes. The gauge wheel only shows about 36 or 37 sizes. What I found is that it doesn't stop at 0. You have 00, 000, quadruple 0, and then I don't know, 5 zeros. So you have 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. Some people break it down into, like, if you have 00, 0 times 2, or 5 zeros would be 0 times 5. But most piercers, and I think a lot of people who deal with larger gauge wire, they end up using either the imperial system or their metric system to determine, because it can get really confusing when you're dealing with so many zeros. So an example of 00, instead of using or saying 00, in the imperial system it would be 3/8 of an inch, and in the metric system it would be 10 millimeters in thickness. So like this maybe. When you flip the gauge wheel to the opposite side, we have the metric system. We have the gauges in millimeter. I use this tool to measure really thin pieces, be it 20, 18, and 16 gauge. It's really hard to distinguish those sizes because they're so thin. Obviously I can tell a 20 and a 16 apart because there's a bit of a difference, but when you throw the 18 there in the middle, so you have 20, 18, and 16. When you have that 18 in the middle, it's hard to distinguish an 18 from a 20 and an 18 from a 16 sometimes. So I use this gauge wheel to kind of measure these pieces. And so how you use it is you take a piece of jewelry or whatever you're measuring and you put it into the slot of the gauge wheel. Not the circle part of it, but just the slot. If it slides through, then that means that that's that gauge. And it has to fit nicely. It can't just like slide through easily. If it slides through really easily, you go to the next size thinner to see if that works. And if it does, then that's the size. If it doesn't, then it was larger size. So this is how it can get really confusing when you're dealing with small numbers and large amount of material, and then large numbers and a small amount of material. In the beginning of the body piercing business in America, people were using gold wire to use as jewelry, and this gold wire most likely came in gauge sizes, and this probably transferred into body piercing jewelry today. The gauges that we most commonly use are 20 gauge, and that's usually just for earlobes, and some piercers are moving away from that. 18 gauge, 16 gauge, 14 gauge, and 12 and 10 gauge in special cases. Sometimes we don't like to pierce much larger than this because most clients will have difficulty healing, but these are the gauges that we use. So it's pretty interesting that we only use even numbers. It makes my life a little bit easier too sometimes. Every once in a while, I will offer either a 14 gauge or a 16 gauge to a client. And sometimes they say they would rather have a 14 gauge because they think it's thinner. But in reality, the 16 gauge is thinner. And this can be really confusing. So I always explain the difference. So if you take a look at regular earring studs, some studs that you can find pretty much anywhere in a jewelry store or a retail store, you will find jewelry with a really thin wire. And this wire is usually either a 20 gauge or a 22 gauge. Today, I believe that piercers are trying to move away from that really thin wire because, like I explained in my earlobe video and my migration and rejection video, heavy jewelry with thin wire can often migrate the piercing and it can cause tears and a lot of problems can occur. So I think that body piercing is moving to a little bit larger gauges, not like extremely large, but larger gauges so that the jewelry will stay in place and be lasting. Sometimes it's also easier to be pierced with a larger gauge and then switch to a thinner gauge later on, because when you take a piercing out and you want to put something new in, it's easier. If it's something thinner, you can just slide right in, and over time your body will just kind of hug onto that piece of jewelry. It'll shrink down and it will fit nicely. On the other hand, if you were pierced with something really thin and you wanted to wear something in a larger gauge, then you would have to stretch up to that size. And this happens sometimes when people want to end up stretching their ears. I'll ask them if they want to be pierced in a larger gauge. Sometimes it takes a little bit longer to heal, but you're already starting at a larger gauge, so you don't have to stretch as much later on. I did mention that gauges go larger than 0, and they go up to 0 times 5, but I believe that's where gauges stop. Well, because piercers and most other people are already using the higher zeros in either the metric system or the imperial system, after we get past 0 times 5, we are already using either inches or millimeters. So if you are stretching your ears, which I will have a ear stretching video coming out, or I guess stretching in general, because you can stretch more than just your ears, I will also discuss the steps and millimeters and sizes in this stretching video. And that's all I have for this video. If you have any questions, I know this kind of topic can get really confusing. I would actually recommend going to other YouTube videos about gauge to kind of get more of an idea of what gauge is. If you have any questions, like I said, leave them in the comments below, and remember to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Bye!